Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
Stay informed with Boise State Public Radio's weekly newsletter. Delivered every Tuesday morning, it brings you the latest local news on politics, the environment, arts, and culture. Plus, get highlights from Idaho Matters and the Mountain West News Bureau. Sign up today at boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. Over a 20-year period ending in 2023, Idaho's population grew about 3 times faster than the U.S. average. And with that growth came a lot of changes to the gem state, especially in rural areas. Now, rural counties, they are aging rapidly. The cost of housing has shot up, and there's a shortage of workers. All these issues are changing the rural character of our state, and tracking those changes are crucial to the future of Idaho. So the Idaho Department of Labor has released its 2025 Profile of Rural Idaho. It's an update to its 2005 look at the economic and social trends shaping the rural populations of our state. Lisa Grigg and Seth Harrington are here. They're both labor economists with the Idaho Department of Labor, and they're co-authors of this latest report. I want to welcome both of you to the program.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Gemma. Happy to be here.
Really good to have you with us. Lisa, let me start with you. Let's start with the report itself. Give us an overlook of what it covers.
This report is really comprehensive, but even though it's nearly 100 pages long, there's still some big sections that we just weren't able to do from the Department of Labor's perspective. But really, it's broken down into 3 main sections. The first section looks at demographics. We're looking at aging. We're looking at the density of the population. We're looking at ethnic breakdowns. The second component of this is really looking at your employment, your wages, a lot of your economic drivers of why are people drawn to rural Idaho, and how is rural Idaho's economy so different from that of the urban counties. And then the last section is looking really at critical trends. And what this is things that are shaping rural Idaho and going forward, what it's going to be its largest advantages, but also some of its biggest challenges to overcome.
And Lisa, my understanding is that this looks at Idaho over the last 20 years and it compares it to that 2005 report. Is that accurate?
That is correct. And there's actually, so we had meant to do this report previously before 2025, but things happened. And so 20 years, especially the past few since the pandemic, have been tidal wave differences in Idaho. And so we decided it was finally time. But we also, you'll see parts of this report that we did intentionally to try to make comparable to the 2005. So we did leave some data that was in there before, so you could actually see the difference if you compare the 2 reports side by side. And that was very intentional from a researcher perspective to try to create a little comparability. The other thing I want to mention is that the definition of rural continues to change significantly and is constantly dynamic. And so it's getting harder and harder to actually compare some of these reports because everyone's definition of rural might be different. And like I said, with it in flux, even federally, it really changes what falls into rural and what doesn't.
So my understanding is the report has 3 sections. So I want to start by looking at the demographics and population. And Seth, when looking at demographics, what sets rural counties apart from urban ones?
Yeah, so we've already addressed a few, namely median, the population for rural counties on average is higher, the age. So median age numbers for our most rural counties in the state averaged at 44 years old, where in our most urban areas it was 37 years old. Rural counties also tend to have a significantly more spread out population. For our most urban counties, we have about 140 people per square mile compared to only 7 for our most rural counties. They also, on the labor side, tend to have slightly lower labor force participation rates. So if we look at the 20 counties with a labor force participation rate below 60%, all of them are rural counties. They tend to have additional challenges with employment, which I think we'll touch on a little later.
Mhm.
Also, since the pandemic, our rural counties have experienced higher percentage growth rates than our urban counties, which was a bit of a surprise to me. And this is a trend that is pretty new, kind of bucks the trend from the past 3 decades. So our rural population growth was 6.9% compared to 6.5% for our urban
Hmm.
counties.
So, Seth, the report also states that in-migration has driven nearly all population growth. So, can you talk about how migration is influencing Idaho's population growth? I mean, specifically in these rural counties.
Yes, Idaho has seen pretty tremendous population gains, especially in the past decade. And so when we look in that population growth hasn't just gone to our urban counties, there's also been a huge impact and a driver in our rural counties. From 2023 to or 2020 to 2023, 94% of Idaho's rural population growth came from migration, compared to only 85% for urban. So it is a significantly larger driver for our rural counties than our urban counties. We've also seen a increasing growth rate for migration into our rural counties. Since 2000, only 11% of Idaho's population growth came from migration, came to rural counties. But as of 2020 to 2023, that 11% has grown to 30% of Idaho's migration has come to rural counties.
Mhm. And Idaho's rural Idaho population, Seth, as you mentioned, it's aging fairly rapidly as well. So can you talk about how much and then how that can impact the character of the state?
Yeah, an aging population tends to put more pressure on our current workforce. And so, as a greater percentage of our population is aging or soon to age out of our labor force, it creates a larger group at the top who tends to work less or not work at all, where a relatively smaller population, a younger population, is there to work and sustain that population.
And then let's talk about racial makeup here in Idaho as well. Seth, how has that changed over the past 20 years?
Yeah, that also is a statistic that kind of surprised me. So migration definitely has contributed to higher statewide racial ethnic diversity. I think the biggest demographic or data point to show this is that rural counties saw a higher growth in Hispanic population than our urban counties. And currently, they have higher rates of a higher rate of Hispanic population compared to urban counties. So it's 16% of rural counties are Hispanic and only 13% for our urban counties.
So let's go to section 2 now. And this looks at employment as well as wages in industry. And Seth, what industries are considered to be a strength when we're looking at rural Idaho?
Yeah, I think not surprisingly, agriculture really is definitely the largest and most prominent for our rural counties, and that stayed the same over the last 20 years. We've also, though, seen, I think, a increasing diversity, especially in those goods producing industries. We've seen greater expansions, especially in the last 2 decades, of food manufacturing and other advanced manufacturing has created good opportunities and kind of diversified a lot of our rural areas, but it's still primarily dominated by agriculture occupations.
And Lisa, can we talk about jobs now specifically? Can you tell us about shifts in where and how jobs are created in rural counties?
Sure. So just as a background, so since the 2005 profile, Idaho's population has shifted more towards the urban zone. So instead of having 68% of its population in its urban counties, it's now 72%. And we saw employment do a similar thing. It went from 74% of employment, now 77% of employment is in your urban counties. And so you're for the most part, you're seeing a lot of industries that are shifting faster towards these urban areas, especially like education and healthcare. But things there there are strongholds and different technologies that are coming up that are actually making rural Idaho competitive. And I think that's actually very exciting. So especially in the last decade, we have seen really different patterns in like telework and broadband. A lot of your rural Idaho still doesn't have very good broadband, but there's great potential with all these BEAD programs going on and the fiber cable that's getting laid down as we speak throughout the state. Um, but I also think that, you've seen especially with the pandemic, there's been a lot of people that have moved to Idaho that have been able to keep their jobs out of state but are working from home. It's not a huge part of Idaho's employment landscape, but it is definitely changing it. You're starting to see people being able to gravitate to those open country, very rural counties and still do a job that they would otherwise do in an urban center, but they're surrounded by mountains and lakes and rivers.
Mm.
And another major trend that's happening here since the pandemic again is Idaho's recreation and tourism industry has just taken off. The I think between 20 and 2021 alone, our tourism numbers were phenomenal and explosive. We had so many people coming into the state to enjoy these amazing amenities that we have. Sorry, but it also with that, so you have all these people that are coming in, but then there becomes the question of sustainability and preservation and how do we protect these assets, but also how do we get enough labor in these remote recreational areas for demand? And it's been a real big issue because there hasn't been enough affordable housing. Their living wages of these workers aren't able to keep up with the cost of living. And so it's really interesting trends that are happening, but I do think that there is some great potential going forward. But there's also right now some of these things are big obstacles, such as broadband and not having
Mhm.
reliable internet. Your rural counties have a much higher share of of sorry, most of them don't have broadband speeds that are up to FCC standards at the moment. And
Mhm.
so that is a limiting factor. But again, it's also, do want to say that with this tidal wave of people that we've had statewide in Idaho and rural in general, again, you have so just a lot of people moving in at one time, and it's really causing major shortages in every single industry throughout Idaho. There's really no industry in Idaho that I believe that has as many people as they would like to have at the moment. So that transition has been quick and kind of painful, especially for our rural counties that just don't have a large labor supply sitting there ready to expand with the population.
So then, Lisa, how does wage play into this? How have wages changed in Idaho over the last 20 years?
Wages are actually really interesting, and there's portions of Idaho where, like Seth's region down in South Central, where rural wages are actually doing really well. They're a high share of people make good livable wages. Um, but I also want to say that when you look at wages, so Eastern Idaho also has seen huge growth. INL has been massive for rural Eastern Idaho for average wages and cost of living there. Also opportunity, away from goods producing jobs into business and professional services and technical services, that kind of thing. But there's still a large part of your um, rural areas that are not able to meet living wages. I want to say around, while half of your urban families make incomes that would cover the average living wage, only about a third of your rural families actually can meet that benchmark.
And Lisa, are there unique or specific barriers to employment, in particular when we're looking at the rural part of the state?
Very much so. A lot of your rural areas of the state are also very seasonal in nature and employment. So when you think about your rural areas, it's sometimes tourism and hospitality, but sometimes it's also forestry and it's farming. And these are often occupations that don't provide year-round employment generally. And so it could result in high turnover and things, but it's also um, each region kind of specializes in its own thing. Together, Idaho's rural areas are very diverse when you look at it in total. But when you look at it as a region, often you're very focused on manufacturing or you're very focused in forestry. Um, there's really incredible differences throughout Idaho, but you don't have a lot of the opportunities sometimes for some of those really higher paying wages that are in industries like information and professional, scientific, and technical. But I think that's actually improving. Professional, scientific, and technical was actually one of those industries where rural gained more concentration over the last 20 years. Um, it's difficult, but I think that again, rural Idaho is becoming more diverse, and does have great opportunity with broadband.
Let's now take a look at section 3 of this new report. And this looks at some of the critical trends that you found. So, Lisa, how does migration into Idaho's rural areas impact farmland succession?
It's a really interesting question, and I know you guys did a great farmland segment recently, which explored some of these topics too. But kind of for us, what we discovered is that um, so with the very fast migration in Idaho, this has raised um, the intensity of competition for farmland for other uses. So what has traditionally been farmland is now looked at as potential for new houses, trying to keep housing affordability reasonable, trying to create enough supply for demand, or even not houses, even retail stores or hospitals or whatever else that needs to accommodate this large population growth. And so what we're seeing is that as land values increase, you actually kind of see a correlation with the number of rural farms that decline. And part of that is just, again, they have a different opportunity, but also it makes farming more risky, because there's higher capital costs. We're even in an agriculture environment with low output prices right now and high input prices. And so that combination, along with, aging of farmers, and when you have this new migration, they don't necessarily have that family legacy of farming, and they may not care to farm. And so sometimes what you're seeing is you see these kind of hot spots of stress between farmers and the community for some of those new community members who maybe don't understand the patterns and cycles of farming, but also don't understand why they can't build a house on what looks to be open land. And so I think it's really created a lot of stress in our rural counties for kind of looking long term. Um, Again, it comes back to that kind of preservation of the amenities that make Idaho run and the vitality
Mm.
that rural Idaho brings to Idaho. And so it's one of those questions that, yes, you could convert 100 acres of farmland into houses and maybe it's no big deal. But if you do that every single year, it's going to start creating problems. So it's really causing a lot of short-term versus long-term views, and needs to have a lot more community discussion and participation, I think. But it's definitely a touchy topic.
And you also looked at public health and the challenges facing public health. So, Seth, can we talk a little bit about that? What are some of the big challenges facing public health, in particular in rural Idaho?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a good place to start is just rural areas tend to have less services in general. And so anything for specialized really for lots of specialists anywhere. Many, if not all, of rural Idaho really has to travel generally out of county, or a pretty substantial commute usually to get those special services if they need them. They're really not in their backyard very often. That's a big issue. We've also seen deaths of despair is really kind of been a growing concern in rural areas. We've seen drug offenses kind of on the rise. Depression and kind of mental health challenges do seem to disproportionately target people in rural areas. And it's kind of a double whammy because, like I mentioned before, they tend to have less access to services than those who live in rural areas.
Mhm. So, Lisa, in your opinion, from this report, what are rural Idaho's greatest strengths?
Well, a big part of what rural Idaho is the natural amenities that surround it. People come from everywhere around the world to explore our 3,100 miles of whitewater rivers and our mountain peaks and our huge amounts of public land. Um, And those are definitely some of it. Also, that recreation and tourism of people want to explore Idaho and see Idaho, and Idaho is a magnetic draw for these people. There's only estimates of about less than half of Idaho's residents actually were born in Idaho. And what that means,
Hmm.
and that's been declining over time, and what that means is that more and more of our population was not born in Idaho. There's estimates about 1 of 8 Idahoans were actually born in California at this point in time. But it's also showing that people are choosing Idaho to live. And what we've seen in the last few years is that people chose rural. I mean, they chose urban as much as well, but we saw rural see a different pattern. People wanted space. They wanted that strong community, which rural Idaho has. Idaho has, these amazing opportunities for vitality and high quality of life in your rural areas and strong community connections. And also has, again, when you look at renewable energy needs, rural Idaho is going to supply most of that going into the future. And so you you want people to enjoy and experience rural Idaho, but you also have to realize that rural Idaho has so much to protect, and that the health of Idaho is really tied to the health of rural Idaho. If rural Idaho is
Hmm.
not healthy, Idaho will not be healthy either.
And Seth, same question for you. In your opinion, from what you learned in this report, what would you say is the greatest strength when it comes to rural Idaho?
That's a good question. I think a pretty similar vein to Lisa on this. I think especially kind of looking forward, the opportunity for energy production for rural Idaho seems to be a really big potential growth for the area. It seems like in the past few decades, it's diversified into manufacturing, and I feel like kind of the next step for rural Idaho is going to be renewable energy production and potentially nuclear for AI data centers is really kind of top of mind right now. But Lisa's also correct that while there's a lot of a lot of demand, a lot of people migrating, and these exciting opportunities on the horizon, there is a lot of tension with farmland and a way of life, and that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the coming years.
And Lisa, what then would be rural Idaho's most pressing challenges right now?
We've already talked about age. I mean, we're looking at, when we look at the prime working age, those are people aged 25 to 54. And then when we did a ratio of those 55 and over, so those who are either retired or considering retiring soon versus those in the prime working age, your rural areas have very low numbers. Even your open country counties, which are the most rural counties, have less than one. So what that means is they have a higher proportion of people over the age of 55 than they do age 25 to 54. And so that's one issue. I mean, there's other things such as access to education. Um, all of your primary 2 and 4 year universities and colleges are based in the 9 urban counties. And I think we're doing actually a really good job of trying to get these educational resources to the rural counties. With you're looking at CTE programs, you're looking at Idaho Launch, you're looking at apprenticeships, and I think those are growing. But I still think that they're not quite as readily available and accessible for rural Idahoans as they need to be. Also, when you look at access, like Seth kind of mentioned, access to high quality healthcare, that's another really strong cornerstone of a vital economy. And when you see that your urban counties have 2 times as many physicians and surgeons per capita as your rural counties, um, it's just one of those issues that, again, kind of looking at response rates, your rural Idahoans were more concerned about affordability, whereas your older urban Idahoans were more concerned about being lonely. And so I think affordability is also a large one. I think a lot of your rural Idahoans feel that they are kind of unable to pay all the bills they want. We are seeing some persistent poverty patterns. So especially for those age 65 and over, that's actually the one segment of Idaho whose poverty's increased over the last 10 years, and especially in rural Idaho. Again, kind of, we're seeing longer commute times. You're seeing your rural Idahoans trying to drive until they can afford it. And so
Mm.
you're seeing those commute times increasing, especially for your rural counties. And I do also want to say that, until broadband actually comes up, it is a barrier. It will be a great opportunity when it happens, but until it's there, it is a huge barrier to some of your very most remote Idaho. Um, and then I also just want to say that the transition of pace. So Idaho has been like the fastest growing state for many years. This is not just an odd thing. It's the norm. It's what we have to accept. But I think that also creates a lot of different ideologies and priorities of the residents that come in. And every resident that comes in kind of has a snapshot of when they arrive in Idaho, like, this is my Idaho. But that snapshot is constantly changing. And there's some people that say that their rural Idaho doesn't exist any longer because, instead of being fields, it's all houses. And so I think that a bigger barrier is really, again, if community participation lacks. I think you may have some pretty strong uh, conflicts between some of the residents' priorities. But on the whole, I think rural Idaho is beautiful and gorgeous, and I am so amazed to be here.
So I have just a couple of minutes left with both of you, and I want to ask you each the same question, and that is, what are the key takeaways that you want people to know from this report? And Seth, I'll start with you.
I think my biggest key takeaways are while a majority of economic activity is still centered in our urban areas of the state, rural Idaho has been growing, especially over the past 2 decades. We have seen substantial growth. We've seen increasing migration. We've seen increased diversity of occupations. We've seen these places really, frankly, transform over the past 2 decades. And so I want people to understand that while rural areas in rural Idaho are sometimes overlooked, they are an important part and an increasingly important part of our economy and our state.
And Lisa, same question for you.
I would say that I've said this a few times, but I think really diving into the data of this report over the last year has shown me just how vital rural Idaho is. And I've heard it a few times that, rural Idaho looks like it's a lot of nothing, like land that's not for anything, but it's what we're doing with those resources that we have in our state, that it's what makes our state what it is. And I just want to say that we're incredibly fortunate, but there's also, you're seeing the relationships change between the different county types, and I think you're seeing, like I said, a very intense competition for what resources we have, more so than maybe we did 2 decades ago. And I'm hopeful that, again, that by doing this report, it sparks conversation and discussion and more looks into, well, maybe this is something we need to consider, and let's look into this before we make this decision, before we veer off a path, and see if it makes sense. But my hope is just that it sparks discussion. And so that's my biggest takeaway, is I'm really curious to see where it goes from here.
Well, I want to thank both of you for coming on and having this discussion with us today. We've been speaking with labor economists Lisa Grigg and Seth Harrington, and we've been looking at the Idaho Department of Labor's 2025 Profile of Rural Idaho. We will put a link to that report on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. This is the Idaho Matters podcast. I'm Gemma Gaudet.
Hey, I'm Peter Pruitt from Zoo, Idaho.
And I'm Dr. Leif Tapinola with the Idaho Museum of Natural History.
Together we host The Nature of Idaho, a podcast all about how our state's amazing landscapes, wildlife, and geology shape life here in the Gem State.
Each week we dive into nature stories from across Idaho, everything from fossils to forests, and sometimes even a few fun facts you can share on your next hike.
So join us as we celebrate everything that makes wild Idaho special.
Listen to The Nature of Idaho from KISU, wherever you get your podcasts, or at KISU.org.